Hi, I'm Jared Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. So I read a lot of design books. I'm fortunate to get sent a lot of new books as they come out for potential coverage on this show. I try to keep up with the latest literature in design and architecture, and I think I have a good understanding of the conversations and the discourse across the design fields. I say all of that not to brag or to talk about myself, but because earlier this year I read one of these new books, a book by the architectural research collective Mold called Architecture is Climate. And at the risk of hyperbole, I feel like this is the most important book on design and architecture that I have read in a long time. It's one of those books that feels like it immediately shifted my gaze and gave me a new lens through which I think about design and architecture broadly, but also in my own work. It's one of those books that feels like it sort of immediately became a new foundational text for me. It's one I've thought about over and over and over again. The central thesis of Architecture is Climate is that we can't separate the practice of architecture, the practice of design, from the climate crisis. The authors write in the first chapter that asking what architecture can do for the climate crisis is the wrong question because it positions architecture outside of the crisis as something that can solve the crisis in some way. The better question is, what does the climate crisis do for architecture? What does the climate crisis do for architecture, for design? To ask this forces us to confront our own fragility and vulnerability. It puts us inside of this crisis, but it also forces us to rethink what it is we do and how we do it. It's a space of opportunity. So I am so excited to be joined by two members of Mold today who also happen to be two architectural thinkers that I have admired from afar for a very long time, Jeremy Till and Tatjana Schneider. Jeremy is an architect and a writer. He was the head of Central St. Martin's and pro-vice chancellor of the University of the Arts London from 2012 to 2022, and has taught and led schools around the world. His 2008 book, Architecture Depends, is another one of those touchstone favorites of mine, and looks at architecture's fight for autonomy, despite being what he calls a contingent discipline. Tatjana is an architect and an academic. She's the head of the Institute for History and Theory of Architecture and the City at the Technical University Braunschweig in Germany, and previously taught at the University of Sheffield. She's the founding member of the architectural co-op Glasgow Letters on Architecture and Space, and co-ran with Jeremy Spatial Agency, a research project examining how architecture could be done otherwise. In the first half of this conversation, we talk about the ideas in Architecture as Climate, what happens when we ask how the climate crisis changes architecture, how architectural practice is tied to questions of not only climate, but also politics, economics, social justice, and ethics, and how these issues are actually really deeply connected. We talk about the limits of sustainability as a way of thinking about environmental challenges and where we can go with these ideas next. In the second half, we talk about how Mold and Architecture as Climate connect to their previous work with Spatial Agency and their interest in reconsidering the positions of the architect. We talk about the role of design education and how to adapt it for the current crisis. Like I said, this feels like such an important and clarifying conversation, one I know I've thought about often since we recorded it. It's easy to feel down after a conversation about these big problems, but I find, and I think you'll find too, that Jeremy and Tatjana's energy and optimism and resolve are so inspiring and frankly uplifting. I hope you find it helpful too. If you like this show and what we do here, you can support our work by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that is free for everybody, as well as a paid tier that gets you a bonus interview each month and really helps keep this show free for everybody. I talk about wanting this show to feel like listening to a great conversation in a coffee shop, and really for the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can help us do this work and put more of it out into the world. We really couldn't do it without you. Jeremy Till, Tatjana Schneider, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Your new book, Architecture is Climate, that is part of the collective mold that you have been involved in for a while now, begins by saying that we need to reframe this question: what can architecture do for the climate breakdown? And you say that the better question is, what does the climate breakdown do to architecture? Tell me about what reversing that question does. How does that change our approach to the climate crisis?
Good question. Because it was a defining moment in the project when we realized what the implications of what feels like a very simple reversal. That the normal construction is that architecture is seen to be doing something for climate breakdown, as if we're standing outside it as a great bunch of benevolent experts who are going to apply patches to this broken world. The trouble with that is they are only patches. Also, that the world is seen as a set of problems which experts can solve, whereas in fact it's a set of predicaments that you have to face. And also that it has a kind of almost temporary feeling to it, that the climate breakdown is treated like the word sometimes is climate emergency, that we can take the planet to hospital and try to fix it, whereas of course we can't. Whereas by reversing it, by saying, what does climate breakdown do to architecture? You have to fundamentally rethink the constructs and cultures of architecture as education, as discipline, and as profession.
One of the ways that you answer that question is, what does climate breakdown do to architecture, is the title of the book. One of your answers is that architecture is climate. What does that mean for architecture to be climate?
What does it mean? It means quite a lot of things. No, when we talk about climate and architecture, we talk about potentially urban climate. We talk about, I don't know, the climate of a room. No? We talk about temperatures. We talk about all these kind of other things that are to do with comfort, maybe, or like a presumed form of comfort. And to talk about these wider notions of architecture, to understand that every single aspect of what goes into buildings, what goes into the processes of buildings, is actually a process that produces emissions to a certain degree. You extract, you mine, you produce, and it's bound into a lot of other processes which have consequences also for this planet. And to say that architecture is climate is then to maybe bundle architecture, whatever architecture is, sort of spatial designs into this kind of really, really dense knot, and to say every single action within a spatial process has consequences for and on the world we live in. And this is, I think, really, really important to say, that it's not just the comfort we feel, but it sits, architecture and all those decisions that we take, it sits in every single aspect. How big rooms are, the type of materials they're constructed with, but also maybe the policy choices that led to certain environments coming up in the first place. And all of that, we don't really talk about this entangled environment, and it's important to keep that in mind when we do it. So architecture is climate means we sit, our actions have consequences, and let's look also and consider these consequences.
But also we talk about the way that architecture and climate are actually very closely related in the way that they're conceived and produced. So they're both relational, they both cut across boundaries and disciplines. They're both temporal, they're kind of found in the past, experience in the present and project into the future. They're both shaped by modernity in the modern project and then by capitalism. They're both experiencing multiple senses. They both affect the modern human world and so on and so forth. So that in a way, understanding architecture as climate is also to understand the way that they're both formed in similar ways, but also can then be reformed in ways which are cognizant of each other.
I think that forming and reforming is actually really interesting. The book is broken down into a series of chapters: knowledge, economy, land, infrastructure, resources, work, policy, culture, which I think I'm actually just thinking about this now as you both were answering that question, is that you could kind of read those chapters, which span a wide range of topics. It's not, these are not always ideas that are talked about in regards to the intersection of design and climate, that you could read these chapters as a like almost revisionist understanding of architecture. You're taking these things that we're familiar with, the economy of design, the way we think about land or infrastructure, and you're taking them out of the way we usually would think about them, and you're putting them into this other context, essentially redefining our understanding of architecture, which I guess is the title of the book. But I'm just making that connection now about this kind of almost like revisionist history of what architecture is. Does that sound right to you?
I'm not sure. Yeah. For us, I think it seems almost normal. I think, I don't know, I look at this and think in a way, oh gosh, I mean, what else would architecture be if
Yeah.
not those things? No? Yeah, so it's I always find it quite peculiar in a way, no? When people say, "Oh, it's maybe a new understanding" or something like that, no? But no, or maybe, you know, as you said, maybe a slight revision or so, but or seeing them in relation to one another. But I think I always think, no, how could you not, no?
Right, right.
Look at architecture in that particular way, no? But I guess it's really, and other people, of course, have worked on architecture and labor or architecture and
Mhm.
infrastructures, no, and in many different contexts. And I think what comes together here is that we define them as sites, no, which are entangled, which are, as Jeremy said, relational. And should not be considered in isolation, but no, together, no, and in overlapping modes.
But just to pick that up even more, because I completely agree with Tatjana that we don't set out to kind of be difficult. In fact, we set out, I think, to be absolutely sensible.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one of the things that I think both of us are kind of bored of is being called provocative. Because as
Right.
soon as you're
Right.
called provocative, then it's easy just to say, okay, they're just this kind of group of people on the left who are just provoking and sticking pins in us for the sake of it. And it's not like that at all.
Right.
There is, I think, a certain kind of speaking truth to power,
Yeah.
which is ever more necessary in the world. And I don't say that kind of complacently. I think it's an important thing to do. But also, genuinely, we're kind of working through the project. We just think, yeah, this is quite sensible.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and that's, you know, I was not trying to say that it was unintentionally provocative in any way, or that it was some sort of radical shift, which I actually want to talk about that idea of radicalism in a second, but more so that I think it is it's a reintegration of these ideas in a way that I think sometimes gets lost in contemporary discourse. You know, as I mentioned at the beginning, this book comes from Mold, which is a research cooperative that you both are involved in. Can you tell me about the origins of Mold and the range of the purview of that research, and how this book sort of emerges from that, just for some context of this position that you both are talking about, of kind of where this comes from?
So Tatjana and I put in for this research grant proposal, which is a German UK joint thing. I was quite busy at the time because I was head of St Martin's, and I just said to Tatjana, okay, we'll do it, but let's do it on our terms. And so we wrote what I think was quite a a kind of punchy research grant application, not with huge hope that we'd get it, and then we did get it. And that allowed us to employ people. And we were incredibly lucky with the people that came forward. And I think Tatjana in particular was brilliant at putting together the kind of dinner party around the table of different characters. And I think we both just realized that so often these research projects are identified with, this is Jeremy's project, this is Tatjana's project. And we just felt that was completely wrong. So that it was Anthony Powers who came up with the word mold, which is both molding the future, but mold as a form of active mycelium and so on and so forth. And we just felt that was a much better way to present the project, because a collaborative can't address the issues of climate breakdown, but a collaborative can do it better than two individuals. And presenting us, the project to the world, as a collaborative thing also then allowed us to collaborate with others rather than, oh, it's just I'm going to be working with Tatjana and Jeremy. And I think that has been really important of trying to just kind of break down some of the hierarchies which are so evident within academia, to allow different voices to come to the table equally.
And of course, I mean, also not naive, no? These hierarchies are there still, no? In a way of like employment, no? And these kind of different things, no? But at least it's also putting it out into the open, no? And it's sort of making it visible also. And I think it was really important also to, I don't know, to show others, no? That we were also actively dealing with these questions, no? Of structures, of institutions, and labor also.
And if I understand correctly, that original research project, that original grant, I think, Jeremy, that you were mentioning, was originally called Architecture After Architecture. Is that the grant you're talking about?
Yeah.
And so I've heard you talk about that title, and that felt too much like a rupture, too much like something new. And I'm curious if you could talk about that kind of original framing and how that evolved into Architecture is Climate.
Oh, I don't know whether I really remember also how it actually came about, no? But I think, no, architecture after, no, the research project itself came out of initial conversations. I don't know. Spatial agency was there, of course, no, and maybe it's quite important to talk about, no, spatial agency as well.
I want to, yeah.
As a project, no, and maybe you come to that, of course, no. And beside, no, sort of these other things that have already been said, I think it's been clear for quite a while to me, but also I think to you, Jeremy, no, that there was time to maybe revisit, no, some of these questions that we have had in spatial agency, no? And spatial agency was somehow written in the context of, no, not actively addressing, but in that in the time of, no, in the financial breakdown, maybe, no, in a way, 2007, 2008, it came out a couple of years after, and in a way, it seemed yeah, timely to look at these questions again of, no, where does architecture stand, no, for the time being. And architecture after architecture seemed like the provocation also needed for the research grant. No, we wanted to get out and say, look, no, we are in a time where a lot of questions are up in the air. No, we seem to have a lot of facts, no, but somehow they're not hitting the ground, no, and somehow architecture is still doing what architecture has been doing for a very, very long time. And why is that the case, right? So it seemed apt to say, no, what is actually architecture? If architecture is no longer, maybe also what architecture is now, no? And maybe, I don't know, Jeremy, maybe you want to continue with that shift into architecture's climate.
I think you're right, though, that I think that we did think it was too much of a rupture, but also in a way, Architecture After Architecture describes the first bit of the project.
Yes.
And the first bit of the project is to identify the complicity of architecture in climate breakdown, to look backwards at upstream at the causes and the way that architecture is so wrapped up in the modernist and colonial project of extraction, of growth, and so on and so forth, and becomes a signifier for that. So Architecture After Architecture is saying, okay, architecture has been complicit. What happens afterwards? And the answer to is what happens afterwards is architecture is climate. So that the other important thing in the discussion we had, and I think it was Tatjana in particular who was insistent that we kept the word architecture.
Mm.
That it would have been, we could have called it spatial agency is climate, or
Yes.
whatever. By saying architecture is climate in a way, and it sounds very modest, what we're sort of saying is let's try to reclaim architecture. Let's reclaim it for what it's good at, and try to leave behind what it's hasn't been good at. So it's a sort of a project, in a way, it's a project of tough love.
Yes.
It's very tough.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
I think it's really tough, actually.
Yeah.
And we accept that. And another conversation we had, the person said, you know, it's excoriating, the opening chapter. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. That's for others to say. But I think that in the end, we get to a point where we are trying to rediscover the agency of architecture under these new conditions of climate breakdown.
Yeah, tough love is always nice, no? Because both of our careers now we stayed in schools of architecture, no? Very firmly, no? Sort of there's no venturing into other ground. No, I studied architecture, I did my PhD in architecture, I'm still in a school of architecture, and somehow, no, it's like, I don't know, staying also with the trouble, no? In a certain way, no? And it's like it's a mixture of despair and hope, and it's like, no, it's like, I don't know, sort of not knowing what to do with it, but also not wanting to get out and leaving the field to others, right? Because there is so much power also in this discipline that needs to be applied wisely and with others. But I think it has the potential to do truly wonderful things too.
Yeah, that's really well said. I feel a very personal connection to that in my own work too, if I'm honest. I have two questions based on that, because as I was revisiting spatial agency to prepare for this, I was struck by how in many ways, and I feel like you both were hinting at this, and so I would love for you to talk about it more, how much architecture's climate is a response, a sequel, a focusing of the work you were doing with spatial agency. Like you said, that project started sort of in the midst of the financial crisis, 2007, 2008. You talked about that project as finding projects that contributed to the future of contemporary architecture. The book that came out with it was, the subtitle was Other Ways of Doing Architecture. It seems like that project was looking for practices that were reconsidering what architecture is and could be. And then architecture's climate continues that, but with a focus or an answer in some way. How do you see those as in dialogue or related to each other, those two projects?
I think you're right. I think they're obviously related, and our discussion continues. The difference is, I think, is that spatial agency, although it's clearly set in a context of, as Tatjana said, of a set of economic and social crises, it is mainly a historical project. It mainly looks back and says, just look at this stuff, isn't it amazing? And it doesn't, and by pointing at that, it allows others to take a bit of whoever they're looking at and possibly use it in their own work. And it has been, it has been an influential project, and that's not, it just has been. And that if we go around the world, lots of people say that it's there as a resource for them, and that's lovely. Although it hasn't changed, we decided to let it stick. Whereas Architecture's Climate obviously continues many of the same themes of other ways of seeing architecture, of the expanded field of architecture, of the way that architecture can rethink itself, but it's absolutely bound to the current conditions. And the way the current conditions have been founded in the past, obviously, but how we might operate within this new kind of set of circumstances that confront us all.
Yeah. I think there are maybe similarities. I don't know. We've not looked at this systematically, no? But spatial agency was very much already putting focus on collective action, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And no, I think when you look at the groups and practices and maybe concepts we described, there was a very strong element of networks, no, of sort of movements of solidarity in a way as well, but also no, people not necessarily operating alone, but with others, no, for others.
yeah.
And I think this is something that continues also in space in architecture as climate. No, there is, I think, hardly anyone no, who is a lone practitioner. So which
Right,
is no,
right.
which is also probably
Yeah,
completely counter to the whole argument in a way. No, but I think there is a sense of collectivity, no, and solidarity that sits in there. No.
I think it's also worth, I think it is a development as much as the book is accompanied by a website called architecturesclimate.net, plug, which is again, I think a very considerable resource.
yeah.
Mm,
And the bit which is called practices opens up by saying, these are practices, but not of architecture as you know it.
Right,
mm,
So
right.
I would say, and I don't think there's well, we don't have any pictures on the website for good reasons, I
Yeah.
think, but there's hardly any people who would you call mainstream architects on it, and
mm,
therefore, and I think that's because it's a sort of indication of our despair that architecture in its current constitution doesn't have the tools or the wherewithal to
mm,
face climate breakdown, and therefore you have to look outside of the discipline to
Mm,
find those tools and wherewithal.
mm,
And I think that is quite a big shift, and it's one which may be difficult for people to take on board because we've got all these wonderful examples, and then you kind of say, well, how am I going to apply that to my project of designing a community centre in Berlin? That's not really the point. It's to say there are other ways of thinking, of operating, of acting, of collaborating in the
uh-huh.
world, which you can
mm,
bring. And I think an important part, the third bit of the website is called Futures, and it's a set of prompts, which we've also turned into cards. And those you can use anywhere. I mean, I don't know if you looked at them, and
Yeah, yeah.
we'll send you a copy of the cards. Use them with your graphic design students.
Oh yeah, I would love that.
See how it helps them,
Yeah.
because what we found is actually the prompts, although the prompts which are taken from a very close analysis of the 120 practices, and we said, what are they doing? What are they doing? What are they doing? We eventually we kind of focused it down to 32 or 3
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
actions, so which you can apply to almost anything.
mm. Yeah, I think, and maybe I'll add to this story a little bit more. It was also obviously personal journeys that that led from maybe one thing to another. No, spatial agency. Before that, I had with friends also founded a cooperative.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
in Glasgow, and we were sort of super active in sort of also opposing certain
Mm-hmm.
actions of the city council. No, and for me, and also for my peers back then, for Glasgow Letters on Architecture and Space, that's what we were called. No, we were sitting there and also struggling with a certain history of architecture. No?
Yeah.
And we were
Yeah.
wondering where those other groups and practices were that dealt with maybe similar issues. And for me, spatial agency was also about saying, look, there are other practices out there, no? And finding those practices that expand maybe the
Yeah.
canon of architecture, right?
Yeah.
And no, so it's a bit of a life journey as well, no? So a little bit further along, no? And
Yeah.
in a way, it's looking back also at architecture practice and seeing, no? And Jeremy's been saying that already, no? That that maybe no, it's not enough to just look at the field of architecture, but some of the issues cannot be solved by spatial practice, no? And therefore it also needs to expand, no? Out of necessity also.
I think that's exactly right. And that sets up two questions that I was kind of thinking about as you were answering that previous question. Because I do think that both of your work, both with mold, but then like we're sort of kind of hinting at all these projects before, are about wrestling with the insufficiency of the discipline of architecture as it sort of stands today. And I'm struck by that tension of wanting to look beyond, wanting to reframe, maybe redefine in some way. But also, Tatjana, what you said, this sense of like that you're staying in architecture. You're in the architecture school. You want the name to be architecture is climate, not spatial agency is climate. So I'm not sure how to phrase this question. I mean, it's a question, what is architecture, maybe, or what is it about that disciplinary core that is important? Talk to me about how you're thinking through both that architecture as a term, as a discipline, as a profession, as an area of study that is insufficient, but also something that feels important in some way. I don't know if you know what I mean?
I don't think it's insufficient.
Mm.
It's insufficient under its own self-determination, under
Uh,
the way that it prioritizes itself and values itself. That's where the insufficiency is, that handing out awards, handing out criteria for education, that is insufficient. But it doesn't mean that the core actions of architectural thinking are insufficient. In fact,
oh,
quite
that's a
the
good way
opposite.
to put that. Yeah.
And that's why I think we are still, well, I'm not, but Tatjana is, and I have been in my career, still invested in architecture education. It's an amazing education. It's just a problem about the way that the profession defines that education. And if you think about an architecture education, that with no disrespect to graphic design, but it's an incredibly sophisticated method of thinking.
Yeah.
It cuts across scales from the
Yeah.
urban to the door handle. It cuts across time. It's relational. Blah blah blah, and it's very different, therefore, than some of the other more product design, for example, which is necessarily more object focused, even though clearly in the good product design schools that you're absolutely dealing with the cultural and historical
Yeah. Yeah.
conditions of that object. But architecture as a broad way of thinking is incredibly expansive, has incredible potential. And I was speaking, actually, it was in this room here. I was speaking with the head of the Government Policy Office, which is a sort of self-contained unit which is hired by ministries to look at difficult bits of policy. And the head of it there was saying that they sort of worked out that architecture graduates are probably the best people they should be employing
Mm.
because of the ability to think in that way that cuts across scale and relationships and that brings together the social and the material and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Let me ask a quick follow-up question to that, and then touch on if you want to add anything, because I think that's getting to the tension that I'm trying to figure out. And this is admittedly a selfish question in kind of my own framing of the work that I do also. And I'm looking for other language here because I think the I think the way you articulated this insufficiency sort of internally, but not externally, I think I agree with. That makes a lot of sense. I'm also struck by this idea of talking about expanding what architecture, expanding our understanding of that, while also acknowledging that it has to sit within a larger ecosystem of other disciplines. And I think sometimes what happens is, and I'm not saying you both are doing this, but what happens is when you talk about expanding the discipline, it becomes a sort of colonization that we are architects as policymakers, designers as economists. And that's not what you're actually saying. And I'm wondering how you kind of negotiate that, or the language you use to talk about that expansive thinking that is also within side even larger ways of thinking. You know what I mean there?
Yeah, I mean, I have a problem with colonization, but I don't have a problem with our students going out and working in other fields and using their architecture intelligence in other fields. I think that's fine. But what the book is saying is that these other sites are productive ways of rethinking what architecture could do.
Hmm.
Therefore, if you take the site of policy and you don't see policy as a technocratic, isolated, wonky,
Yeah.
full of policy wonks, not wonky, full of policy wonks, but you see policy as a place of imagining the future, yeah, then you can see how policy then can be used as part of an architectural field. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So that an architectural field can encompass issues of policy, issues of economics, issues of infrastructure. It doesn't mean to go out and kind of claim those in a kind of immodest manner. It means that that architectural thinking can be expanded to accommodate some of these others into what otherwise is quite limited by the only thing that you can use as a context is the stuff of a building.
Right.
But what happens if you use your context the stuff of policy, the stuff of economics? Then I think that you are expanding, but not in a way which is colonizing.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe adding to that, no, if no, we talked about architecture after architecture and also these sort of complicity maybe of architecture and producing certain environments, and no, architects always, I don't know, being in bed with power, I guess. No, this is the very foundation of the architecture profession. In a way, no, it's always been something that no, people have been working for kings and queens and no, other monetary elites. No, and in a way, as soon as we begin to understand the kind of no, policies and norms and stuff like that, as no, I think for a very long time we've seen these as something that we simply yeah, I don't know, implement in a way. No, there's a policy out there and architecture implements. No, there is a rule out there and architecture implements. No, there is a brief out there and architecture reacts. No, in a way, and I think what architecture as climate is also saying. Look, these are also instruments that can be molded, no? That can be
Yeah.
changed with
Yeah.
the knowledge that we also bring to the field and also need to be addressed. No? So not seen as static entities, but yeah, important instruments also for transformative action.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think this gets to early in the book, you sort of talk about the limits of the language of sustainability. That things like LEED certifications, in many ways, are these band-aids or these sort of solutionist kind of oriented approaches. Can you talk to me, or just sort of explain to listeners who have not read the book the insufficiency of this idea of sustainability and why this reframing of architecture as climate goes beyond that?
Well, the clue is in the word. Yeah, sustain. So the implication is that we can sustain our current
Yeah.
ways of living.
Yeah.
And that what we need then to do is that, accompanied by sustainability, are these words like adaptation, like resilience, which are sort of just so passive. You know, you kind of accepted that there is a crisis, and all you can do is put up a few sandbags, as it were. But it doesn't begin to address the causes of that crisis until you dig into the causes. Actually, any resistance is in a way it's not futile. I mean, I understand sandbags; they are going to save a few lives, but it doesn't actually get to the nub of the issue. And sustainability in its current guise is basically a kind of a system of minor mitigation with a lot of greenwash over the top of it.
If we put it in examples, no, we talk a lot about no, sort of certain infrastructures, but maybe also certain buildings which are inherent, or building typologies which are inherently unsustainable. No, we can, I don't know, we can obviously give airports and sort of I don't know,
Right.
Halliburton headquarters or no, the Deutsche Bank main office buildings a LEED certificate, no, and say this building is absolutely carbon neutral. But it also doesn't really address the issues at hand and the kind of practices that potentially are at the core of these businesses, these buildings, yeah, house, no?
Right,
Right.
right.
So I think we have to talk about more than no, sustainability being applied to a very narrow kind of thing, no? But
Yeah,
understand
yeah.
these kind of things in context. And that goes for no, detached housing. It goes for also the resources that go into it. No? So these small units, yes, of course, we can give them certificates, but it's sort of missing the point too. No?
Right, right. And I'm curious, I think the way you phrase that is it still prioritizes the object or the building in some way. And I'm interested, we've been talking sort of around education. You both are educators. I'm an educator. I'm really interested in the implications of this for architecture and design education. In the book you write, and I'm just going to quote a section for you for a second. The reliance on solution-oriented briefs perpetuate the same extractive logic, constraining the potential for addressing deeper systemic challenges and fostering a more process-driven, holistic approach. By compartmentalizing learning into discrete categories like design, history, theory, technology, professional practice, current education fails to reflect the holistic and relational approach that climate breakdown demands. How how should we be thinking about, or maybe how are both of you thinking about what is necessary in architecture and design education to reflect the relational approach that the climate breakdown demands? What does that actually look like in the classroom?
I think this is a super complex question, and I
Yeah,
think
I
we
know.
could talk for hours about what that means. But I think people, I don't know, I'm still surprised at how big a role building designs play in the context of design studios. And yes, no, I mean there are exceptions to the rule, and yes, no, there are no, and it's also hopeful to see that more and more schools are shifting focus also not to no, new build, but maybe also conversions of existing buildings, which is maybe the kind of new thing. But I think questioning no, the importance of that object, I think for me is one of the key things, right? But also it's about how you give briefs, no? The kind of things that you determine, the kind of environments you put students into whenever they discuss certain things. It's about, I don't know, also giving time to actually do research. No?
Mm,
Very often projects are very, very time limited, and people say, look, no, people have to exercise their sort of no, whatever design skill, whatever that means, and there is no time to actually look at the question again that was
yeah,
posed
yeah.
in the first place. No? There is also stuff about the presumed output, no? And I think I don't know. It's Cedric Price who's quoted all the time no? in this context when you have to say, well, the design might not be the best solution to
Right, right.
problem, of course, no, and this is still so true. So very often, I think, no, it's this kind of solution-driven
Yeah.
environment, which simply produce buildings in the end when it's actually not necessary the building that is necessary in many instances. Huh? So I would wish for environments where no, where you can actually engage in sort of these questions, where there is time to do research, where there is an understanding of like no, a certain question not having to lead to a certain answer. No? When design would also be understood as a much more broad set of skills, right? But in the German context, and maybe that's the same for the UK, but maybe also for the US, no? That also necessitates a discussion with the key holders, maybe, no? To those professions. No? We are very, very closely tied to the professional systems, and
Mm-hmm.
accreditation systems are
Mm-hmm.
no, in very close link to schools of architecture. And I think it also needs a much bigger and concerted effort to understand that studying architecture does not necessarily lead to you going into a standard architecture practice where you design buildings, but no, you can actually do many, many more things with that. So breaking that tie would be for me one of the key, things to
Yeah, I
do.
Yeah.
completely agree. Because what's interesting is that as architecture as a profession is under increasing pressure, as it's getting more and more marginalized, as other disciplines are coming in, as all architecture is capable of doing now is wrapping up capital and so on and so forth. In a strange way, the systems of accreditation are getting tighter and tighter. They're sort of they're holding to the kind of this center, this mythological center of architectural quality and wonder in terms of the production of buildings, when exactly what they should be doing is releasing it and being generous and saying, that's interesting, that's an amazing way of seeing the world. And that could be part of a newly formed accreditation. But we're never going to get that in the UK. You almost certainly won't get that in the US, because architecture is so wrapped up in a certain type of economy. And this hysteria which is going on in the UK is not loosening the hold on architecture schools. It's tightening it.
Same here, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of exactly where I was headed with this too, is because I think there's it can very quickly feel defeatist where it is. There is a larger infrastructural system that exists that makes it hard to make any of these changes. And so what happens is it's like, we're going to teach a sustainable class, or we're going to teach a circular class or something, and then those are just band-aids in their own way. And I see this in my students also, where they are interested in being politically engaged. They're interested in doing work that is living outside of a capitalist system. And then they're also like, but I also need a job. I need to have stuff in a portfolio. I do need to make things, right? How do you sort of negotiate that individual agency within the sort of systemic structures? And you could talk about that both generally, but also maybe in both of your positions where you are teaching classes and running or previously have run schools, how you kind of negotiate the what can you do versus, how do you change the system, or how do you work within the system?
Well, there's a difference between working within the system in a kind of passive way which just accepts the system, or working within the system in a way which has a impulse to transform it. And an impulse to transform it can be quite modest in a way. It doesn't need to be, I'm going to go in and blow up Norman Foster, as it were.
I was waiting for that. I've listened to a lot of interviews with both of you, and I was surprised he hasn't come up yet.
Well, sorry to be a cliche, but
there's so many villains.
I'm here for it.
Norman Foster just stands for a certain type of architectural production. It's not about him personally.
I understand.
And therefore it's not necessarily, although we might at a political level believe that the undermining and the critique of the forces of capital is an important thing to do. We absolutely, I've had this, and I remember I was particularly emotional one year about lecturing at St Martin's. It's just after my brother had been arrested for climate activism. And the students said, God, Jeremy, that was really, really tough, your course. It was really tough because you were so emotional about it. Where does that leave us? And I suddenly felt, oh my God. And then I did think about it, and I think that both of us do, and what I'm sure you do too, is actually you actually have to start from a point of ethics. You have to start from a point of view that an education is also an education in ethics, of developing an ethical standpoint towards the world. Now, that ethical standpoint often then becomes translated into a political standpoint as well. But at the very, the definition of ethics which I take is one from Zygmunt Bauman, which is really simple, which is the definition of ethics is to assume responsibility for the other. And the other is multiple. It's people who make your building, live in your building. It's the more than human. And as soon as you take that as a definition of what education should be about, doesn't start with a kind of an angry thing, I'm going to go and break down the forces of capital. It starts with an understanding of the world as this set of relationships of which we have responsibility for when we are making actions. Now, that doesn't seem to me to be, how could anyone disagree with that?
Right.
I would say
Right.
it's such a fundamental way of seeing the world. But if all you're doing, being allowed to do, is to produce a building, then sometimes ethics is washed out of it. In fact, I would say in the majority of time, ethics is washed out of it. And if you get back to this idea of what's a radical project, the radical project, I think, at the moment, is design in gratuitous form. That's an incredibly radical thing to do, given the state of the polycrisis. And it's unbelievably dumb. And in being unbelievably dumb, I think it's unbelievably radical.
Yeah. Yeah, this is really beautiful. I don't know. I'm also always thinking about how you can actually, I don't know. No, I am in an institution, right? And every institution also has cracks. Now, and this is also what we do with Architecture's Climate, of course. No, we show the structure, we show this massive, I don't know, really heavy stuff, but we also talk about the things that might crack also the system, the practices that have the potential to shift discourses, to change conversations, to bring in true transformation, right? And it's maybe also bringing in Isabel Stengers and the barbarisms that were sort of situated within, and the kind of resistances the multiple resistances that exist. So we also try to foreground resistance, no? And how you organize, no, for resistance, how you make networks of solidarity, how you join these kind of systems. And also, no, I mean, we have amazing structures globally also, no, the cooperative movements, no, sort of all sorts of different amazing action groups, no, that are out there and that are also really truly important for that struggle that is to come, right? So it's really a lot about talking about these things that exist, no, that one can go into, and of course it's difficult, and of course it's also emotional, but I think it's also really important to bring that emotion. Jeremy, I think it's really important to bring that emotion into the classroom. No? It's not an abstract discipline. It's not something that doesn't affect anyone, but it is about our lives, basically, no? And our futures. And why should that also not be emotional? No? And sort of dealing with these emotions that sit in there, I think it's truly no? Important. No? And giving space to those emotions too. No?
Yeah, I feel like that is so well said and such a nice way to wrap this up. And so I'm going to ask you just one other question because I want to end on that note. I'm curious where all this goes next. You know, you have the book out. Mold is still in operation. What happens now, or like what are both of you kind of thinking about where this all goes or where you want this to go?
Yeah, I I don't know. I think we've just published the book, right? No, and I think for the time being, I'm interested in sort of also talking about it, no, and sort of taking it into different contexts, no, connecting to others. And over the past few months, I think it's been amazing already to see, you know, the kind of other disciplines that are picking up on it, no, sort of. No, and I'm interested for the time being in sort of really sort of knitting, no, no, and making new knots, I think, with it, no, and really also understanding maybe where possibilities for action lie, and working on those possibilities for actions, realizing, of course, no, and I live in Germany at the moment where no, we have quite difficult discussions also about the autonomies of universities and what can be said and what can't be said, and no, sort of no, in bigger geopolitical contexts as well. No, so I think for me it's truly about I don't know, finding also these other networks and connecting the discussions from architecture as climate with these other action groups. No, and this is truly important to me in this context. No. And
Completely. I mean, I'm now free of institutional life, so I can do other things. I can go and get arrested, which I wasn't able to do before, but also
in which you did, yeah.
which I did, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, I've just finished, so I can tell you, I just finished because it'd probably never be published, but everyone said I'd got to do a follow-up to Architecture Depends about architecture education. Architecture Depends is a book I wrote.
Yeah. We didn't get to talk
Um,
about that, but maybe
and
next time.
so I've done that, but it's a novel. So I've
Oh,
written a novel about architectural school in 1992. So that when it's published, I will disappear to a foreign island and never be seen again because it won't make me popular. But to pick up on Tatjana says, absolutely. I mean, that when Sarah Bigglesworth, my partner, shut her practice down, we had space, and we've given that over to an amazing group of democracy and climate activists, people who set up XR and so on and so forth, who have a very, very wonderful way of seeing how to think about action and democracy and community. And so I'm going to be working more with them, and certainly some of the ideas from Architecture's Climate are very related to what they're doing. So that's when I've finished the 18th draft of the novel, I'm just on the first, then that's where I'm going.
I'm kind of mad you brought up the novel at the end. I feel like I have a series of questions about that, but we'll talk again when if and when it ever comes out. You used a phrase earlier, tough love, which I feel like is right for this conversation. I think it's really easy for these types of conversations to feel defeatist and to feel down. And I did not get that from the book. I do not get that from either of your work. There is an optimism, a sense of hard work still to do, and a belief that things can be otherwise. And I think that came through in this really, really beautiful and inspiring conversation. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed this. I loved the book and just am a huge admirer of both of your work.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Jared. That's really sweet of you. And it's always good to have new questions because I will listen to the podcast and rethink things. And I'm sure Tatjana will too. So thank you for your questions because the conversation is only as good as the people in it.
That was my conversation with Jeremy Till and Tatjana Schneider. They are part of the Mold Research Collective, and their new book is called Architecture is Climate. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is funded thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcast and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.